Good afternoon, everyone, and can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. The main item today is a discussion with invited guests on the Help to Buy equity loan scheme in London. Members of the public can follow the meeting on the webcast and on Twitter using hashtag assemblyhousing and hashtag help to buy. And please may I remind members, guests and audience to turn their phones off or put them on silent. Can I ask the clerk if any apologies have been received?
Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Gavron, for whom Assembly Member Arnold is substituting.
Thank you, and thank you, Jeanette. Welcome. So matters arising from the annual meeting of the London Assembly on the 2nd of May 2019. Membership of the committee, terms of reference and standing delegation. Following decisions taken at the London Assembly meeting on the 2nd of May 2019, can we note the membership and chairing arrangements for the Housing Committee as stated on the supplementary agenda? Noted. Can we also note the terms of reference for the Housing Committee as stated in the supplementary agenda? Noted. And can I ask members to note the standing delegation to me as chair of the Housing Committee as stated in the supplementary agenda?
Yes, noted.
That's not what it says on my script, but that's usually what it says. Declarations of interest. Can I ask members to note the list of officers on the report and ask if they have any additional interests to declare? No. Minutes. Can we agree the minutes from our previous meetings held on the 26th of March 2019 and 2nd of April 2019? Yes. Can I ask members to note the outstanding actions arising from any previous meetings? Yes. And can I ask the committee to note the action taken under delegated authority? Yes. And that brings us on to today's main item, which is on the Help to Buy equity loan schemes in London. Can I first ask members to agree the areas for consideration as set out in paragraph 4.8 of the report? Thank you. And can I welcome our guests? Henry Pryor, who is a buying agent and market commentator. Professor Yolande Barnes, chair of the Bartlett Real Estate Institute at UCL. And Daniel Tomlinson, research and policy analyst at the Resolution Foundation. Thank you all very much for being here today. So I'm going to kick off with a few initial questions. First of all, if I could ask Henry, and I know, Henry, you've been quite outspoken on the Help to Buy scheme, and can you briefly outline the original rationale for introducing the Help to Buy programme?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not entirely confident that this is the official line, but my understanding of the rationale behind Help to Buy was an initiative that was brought in by central government as a way of encouraging mortgage lenders or giving confidence to mortgage lenders, banks and lending institutions to get back out and lend money after the credit crisis crunch, call it what you will, of 2007-2008. A policy that gave lenders the optimism, perhaps, to overcome their, at the time, understandable reservations about the direction of house prices in certainly the short term, and their, again, in my opinion, understandable desires to minimise their exposure and risk. At the time, they were keen, for reasons I just explained, to insist upon new borrowers putting up significant deposits in order to ensure that if prices were to fall, they were protected. They, the lender, was protected. This additional requirement, usually 20%, sometimes more, was a massive impediment, particularly to those trying to get onto the lower rungs of the housing ladder, where saving for a deposit was already taking the best part of a lifetime and was clearly going to be impossible for an awful lot of people without some kind of intervention. So the government's, I think, on balance, sensible plan, a plan that perhaps remarkably actually worked, was that they were going to stand behind, in their first iterative of Help to Buy, there were several different flavours that came along, equity loan, mortgage guarantee, being the two principal ones, was that they would stand behind the borrower by underwriting or providing part of that deposit in order for lenders then to be comfortable that their exposure was still only going to be, for the sake of argument, 80%. As I say, a policy that I think worked at the time, even with hindsight, was a good idea, but as you may or may not discover, and depending on how forensic your questioning becomes, is not something that I necessarily agree should have been or indeed should still be maintained.
Well, we'll be coming on to, my colleagues will be coming on to that in more detail as we go through the session, but thank you. Yolande, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to emphasise its novelty on introduction of actually addressing the equity gap rather than the subsidising mortgage borrowing per se, and I think recognising that the barrier to home ownership for a lot of people is not being able to afford mortgage repayments, but being able to raise the equity as Henry just described.
Okay, thank you. And why did the government double the percentage loan available in London in 2016, and what difference did that make to London take-up?
As I understand it, the take-up in London was actually low because the value limits were too low. And I think the further change for 2021 of actually regionalising the values is probably a good move in this respect. So take up in London in the early years was notably lower than in other regions.
And in terms of your view on the scheme as introduced and the scheme now, do you concur with Henry or do you take a different view?
Like many interventions, I think it's questionable whether it achieved its aims, and some of the judgment on that has to be with how you understand what you understand its aims to be. I think certainly, like most interventions, it probably has had unintended consequences or unexpected consequences, which I think are important to look at. I think some people do refer to it on the slide as help to build rather than help to buy, because its focus on new build properties has had, I think, a distorting effect, which bears some examination.
And we will be coming on to some of those more unintended consequences, potential unintended consequences as we go through the meeting. Daniel, do you want to comment on what you've heard?
I think just to add, I guess, a different perspective. So Henry's totally right, and I totally agree that part of the rationale was to encourage confidence in terms of lenders, but also, and this is what Yolande was talking about as well, I guess, building and supporting house building and encouraging building was, I think, part of the rationale, even though it was framed in a way of supporting people to get on the housing ladder. Actually, I think supply was probably an element underneath it too. I did a bit of digging, and I think the new Labour scheme, which was called Home Buy Direct, which came out in 2008, was much more explicitly about supporting house building and increasing supply itself. So I think there's supply side impacts to the policy and demand side ones as well, which we'll get to, I imagine.
Excellent, thank you very much. Well, that's all for me from now, and I'm going to bring in to ask our next set of questions, get some more detail, Assembly Member Curtin.
Thank you, yeah. Good morning, everyone. Yeah. So
Good afternoon, tragically. It's all gone already.
When did you get up, David?
It's going to feel like this evening by the time we finish with it, but yes.
Jokes there. Oh dear, I know. So I want to ask you basically about the impact of the Help to Buy on the housing market, specifically in London. And I'll start with you, Yolande, if I could. Do you think we actually needed Help to Buy in London when it was started in 2013?
Well, you could say that the equity gap, as it were, was probably largest in London. So if did you need a scheme to help people who found the housing market inaccessible due to not being able to raise the equity, then probably I'd say you'd need it more in London than elsewhere, simply because the size of sums involved. However, I think it is worth concentrating on where the real sort of affordability need lies in London. And I think it's quite demonstrable that most of the demand and most unmet demand is in the sort of sub £450 per square foot area of value. I can't remember the average rate per square foot, but certainly in the more central areas of London, most of what's being built is over 750 a square foot. So there's a mismatch between what's being supplied and therefore what's being helped in this area. So there's the theory and then there's the practice. So the fact it was aimed at an area of supply that was very expensive in and of itself, and it didn't reflect the whole market of what's available throughout the whole of London. I think immediately started to distort how it was targeted and how it was used. So in theory, yes, doing the right thing in addressing the equity gap. In practice, too focused on a niche market, if you like, and not addressing the broader issue.
Okay. Thinking about the number of homes that have been built, I mean, is there any sort of evidence or any figures for how many homes would not have been built if there wasn't the Help to Buy scheme?
Nationally, it appears to have potentially doubled the rate of build, in as much as before the scheme, I think roughly 1 in 11 transactions were new build properties, and I think that's pretty much halved now to about 1 in 5. Whether that's a temporary effect, how much it has to do with other factors, it's and indeed the very low levels of transactions generally, you have to take that against a quite significant fall post 2008 in the numbers of properties being transacted. It would appear that new build at a national level takes a higher constitutes a higher proportion of sales now than it used to. So
is that sort of 2013 to 2018, sort of the doubling of the proportion of new builds that you're talking about?
Yeah, so if you take new builds as a ratio of second-hand stock or transactions, it seems to have risen at a national level. I haven't looked at London specifically.
Okay.
But the expectation would be that it probably has increased build levels or supply level, new supply over and above what it would otherwise have been.
So that's national figures. What about London specifically? Are there any figures on
As I say, I haven't looked. I haven't got figures on London.
No problem.
Are you able to send the figures to us afterwards, perhaps? I mean, if you haven't got them to hand. Sorry to come in on your question, David, but obviously it's very interesting to hear about the national figures, which you clearly do have at your fingertips, but with the London Assembly, and certainly and I'm sure others might be interested to know if there's been the difference from 1 in 11 to 1 in 5. That you
I'll certainly see if I can drill down.
That'd be very helpful.
Really helpful.
Thank you very much.
Yolande.
Okay, Assembly Member Kirk.
Thanks. Yeah, is that the 1 in 11 to 1 in 5? And would you say that's all directly due to the Help to Buy scheme, or is that a variety of factors? Or
it's impossible to say for sure. I mean, obviously, that time period coincides with the Help to Buy scheme, but of course, what you have at the same time is this significant drop in the number of second-hand transactions. So whether new build, I mean, having said that, we're talking about a decades-long trend, which was the 1 in 11, that at a national level, new build property only ever seemed to reflect the overall market rather than create a new market. So roughly, 1 in 10, 1 in 11 transactions, no matter what level transaction levels were at, would be new build. So whether stamp duty, and Henry will probably have something to say, whether other factors like stamp duty and indeed the effects of recession, credit crunch and so forth have also had an effect. It's difficult to say for sure.
Yeah.
But there must have been some impact from Help to Buy there.
I know you want to come in there. Just another question on that. I mean, talking about changing from 1 in 11 to 1 in 5, which is a sort of a proportion, so it's going up from about 9% to 20% of the market. But is there that significant change in the absolute numbers? I mean, the sort of the numbers of new build houses, has that changed significantly or not? I mean, is that doubled?
Well, supply waxes and wanes, but yes, supply has been rising at a national level since 2013.
But has it doubled? Has it gone up by the same amount in terms of proportion of the total market?
It might, yes, 275,000 I think was the latest. Yeah.
Fine, okay, that's great. So there's sort of correlation there, thanks. So Henry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to add in, for the committee's benefit, you may not be aware that there was a time when one particular flavour of Help to Buy was also available for second-hand homes. And therefore, the data which, understandably, quite rightly, you love to get your hands on and quite rightly asking us to produce, isn't actually as readily available and as transparent as it ought to be, because there is this muddle, which is probably quite helpful to your professional colleagues across the river, that there's a bit of confusion in it. But it's not very easy for us to be able to provide, or anybody to be able to provide definitive figures on London. And I would add that your question, cunningly put, if I may say, talks about whether it's possible to identify what wouldn't have been built had it not been for Help to Buy, which is not a metric that one can readily compute. You know, what day previous to today might I have died if I was dead today? So it's important to understand that we can talk about the positive numbers as opposed to the invisible numbers, if you will, of what would have happened if something hadn't been available. Finally, you'll be pleased to hear, I would also add that, in my opinion, something that, again, over which there is debate, I think house builders would have continued to build properties. My complaint fundamentally about Help to Buy is that there are two options when it comes to dealing with high house prices, something that is not necessarily the same as unaffordable house prices. You can either leave the market to adjust to the level that people can afford in order for transactions to continue, or you can intervene and support either by pushing down on rents, for example, or pushing up on deposits, or interfering in a proactive way. But that does distort the market, and at some point when you withdraw that interference, or you cease that interference, the market will then inevitably correct itself and the pendulum will swing back. Be careful what you wish for, I think is what I'm saying.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, Stanley.
Just to come in again on that point, one of the interesting things in the data is that the increase in housing supply starts around the same time as Help to Buy is announced nationally in April 2013, but it actually starts just before. So you can see an uptick in the trough in the amount of building is a few months, I think it's the quarter before Help to Buy is announced. And so, or at least Help to Buy is implemented. So you can see that house builders and developers were beginning to build more. The shock of the crisis, the retrenchment in terms of their activities, and the big plummet that happened in terms of young people's, in particular, incomes after the crisis was beginning to wear off, only beginning to back in 2013, but you can see there was an uptick beforehand. So that sort of gets at the point that Henry was making. It's very difficult to identify that counterfactual. The government did they did quite a thorough report on the impact of Help to Buy nationally, and they asked developers, they just said, so how much do you think how much additional has your supply been because of Help to Buy? And the number that they write in, the number the government cites in its report is about a fifth from developers, so about a fifth more. So that gets at this difference between the 50% that Yolande was talking about and the 20% that came from...
Specifically, just on that point, I checked with the House Building Federation before coming here. They would confirm that number for London as well as nationally. Whether that's correct or not, that's their view.
Supply or...
A fifth. This figure of 20% applies in London apparently as well as nationally.
Okay. Yeah, so that's...
Of course, a developer that might be benefiting from Help to Buy has an incentive to say that it's having more of an effect than it might be. We don't know exactly. We can't know because it's the counterfactual.
Indeed, yeah. Thanks. If I can move back to you, Henry, again, and just ask about new build houses in London specifically, and with the new build houses, is there any evidence that Help to Buy has inflated the prices of new build homes in London?
Difficult. The word I struggle with is evidence. So there appear to be numbers that seem to suggest that exactly that has occurred. Equally, as with most legal debates, arguments in a pub, there are different opinions depending on where you start from, and there are, particularly amongst the house building fraternity, those who suggest that that's not the case at all. My own view, my own opinion, is that it has added to the cost of new build homes. It has added to the percentage that it goes on top of a shiny new home over and above its second-hand value. So when you buy a new build home, there is a new build premium that is acknowledged even by the house building fraternity, because quite reasonably you're buying a brand new product. It's like buying a new car. Someone's gone to the trouble of planning it, designing it, getting the relevant consents, getting all the testing dealt with, and they deliver it to you, and therefore you should expect to have to pay perhaps a premium for the privilege of buying something that's bright and shiny and new. And just as with new cars, there is, I think, a strong argument that the morning you wake up after your first night in the property, it's worth less. The new build sector desperately wants to commoditise property, and as the prof here has said, they talk about houses per square foot, per square metre, unbelievably in parts of London, per cubic metre, would you believe it? But housing, new build housing, perhaps gets away, or is slightly excused, in my opinion, this desire to want to price things per square foot, because it's got business involved in it, underpinning it. It's got financial scribblers across the river writing notes to support the building and sales of this product. But it doesn't take into any account the emotional element of value, which I principally deal with in the second-hand market, which rather like fine art or pictures, or is the view, the price of the view, the value of the view from the window, for example, or the proximity to your friends, or the proximity of positives or negatives, perhaps near the property itself. So these are things that I would contend all support the fact that Help to Buy, whilst I should stress again, it is something that I think was a force for good and ironically a great idea at the time. I think it outstayed its welcome for far too long, and it did distort, and it continues to distort the market. And most importantly, and particularly in London, I suspect that when it ends and it's withdrawn, the fallout will be painful for those who are least able to afford it, and significant. There will be significant impact on people such as your good selves.
I mean, I was talking about the new builds, but then you've widened that to talk about the wider housing market. So, do you think, what effects do you think it's had on the price of homes in the wider market? Has it had a significant effect?
There will have been some wash on. I've never seen figures quantifying exactly what that is. I could, as an estate agent, convince you that I know the answer to this, but I don't. But the answer is on the new build sector, that if you buy a flat today, a new build property today, with the benefit of Help to Buy, in 5 years' time, that, unless it is replaced, that benefit won't be available to your successor, the person you want to sell that property to. And without that, they won't be able to afford to borrow as much money as economically as you can today. And as a result, I think you will end up having to nurse potentially not just a theoretical, but actually a practical loss, one that could be very painful for a lot of people to deal with.
Okay. And how about sort of the distribution of Help to Buy?
Sorry, David, can I just on the point about pricing, if I could just interject for a moment. I was interested in the impact of the £600,000 cap. Does that mean a lot of homes are sort of being rounded up to 599,999? Whereas you might have got a home that would have sold for 570, but they
Super question. We don't have any evidence. There's no way of measuring it because I don't have formal links with house builders who will formally confirm that that's going on. But human nature being what it is, I very much fear that that is exactly the case. And as the market has stiffened, as it's become harder to shift these units that have been planned and constructed over many years to bring them to market today, house builders, developers, their agents, their funders are all trying to desperately find ways of attracting sales that come in at the threshold or just below, whether they are including things that perhaps they shouldn't be including in those deals, stamp duty payments, moving expenses, decoration, furnishing, all these sorts of things, all sorts of sweeteners to help people, encourage people to take the product. I suspect is going on, but I'm afraid that may, as far as the committee is concerned, just be a reflection of my rather jaundiced nature and deep suspicion of human nature.
Yolande, do you...
Well, one way of answering that question is to look at what the new build premium is over and above second-hand stock in the same location. And the thing about the new build premium is that nobody publishes any figures on it. The little work I have done in the past suggests that it does fluctuate significantly according to market conditions. So if you have a low demand, high supply market, you will have a much lower new build premium, or even a new build discount. So in the extremes, in the early 90s, you actually had a new build discount, and new build properties were oversupplied relative to demand, and therefore were selling at a discount to second-hand stock. I mean, it's been a long time since London's seen that. But the sheer size of the new build premium, if you were to look at specifically at sort of neighbourhood level, would tell you or give you some indication of the effect that this scheme might at least in part be having. And I think there are reasons why over the last few years the new build premium should have been shrinking, not disappearing, but shrinking in size, and not least because of fuller supply. But the signs are it hasn't been. And I'm afraid at the moment that's sort of anecdotal, and probably could do with some more research on it. And that, to me, would seem to indicate that this has had an inflationary effect in the new build sector over and above the second-hand stock, which, of course, it doesn't have an impact on.
Surely there will be a long-term impact then for the purchaser. If they've overpaid for a property, then that could seriously disadvantage them over the longer term.
Yeah, I mean, the new build premium is potentially a problem anyway, because, as Henry says, it starts depreciating from day one. Now, in the past, we've had very high levels of capital growth, which have hidden that depreciation effect. So people have been able to buy a newly built property and effectively write off against their capital gains the depreciation of that new build premium. I'm not sure that's going to happen in future. I think, in common with a lot of global cities, we've probably reached what I call a high plateau, where prices are expensive, they're high, but they're not rising as rapidly as they used to. And that is going to start to reveal all sorts of issues. The new build premium, or erosion of it, or depreciation of it, or depreciation full stop, is one of them. Obsolescence may be another, so we have to consider, has what's being supplied actually the right stock for the longer term? Or has it just responded to a particular moment in time, distorted by a different sort of demand as a result of partly of Help to Buy? And the other thing we're going to start noticing is the ongoing running costs of buildings, which people just haven't really considered before. Service charges, been something that's just the cost of making a lot of money from your property in London. It's very possible, especially for some types of building which are particularly expensive to run, particularly the sort of thing that we've been building over the last decade or so, that you're going to really start to notice those service charges, and that's going to put additional affordability pressures on the population, which perhaps in the past they haven't noticed so much.
Well, we will be hopefully looking at service charges later in the municipal year, so we might need to get you back for that. Sorry, before I hand back to Senator McCurtain, Daniel, do you want to comment on any of these?
A few things have come to mind while that interesting discussion was just going on. The first thing is there is a little bit of evidence around a bunching at 600,000 in London. When you look at it, I think it's relatively small, but you can see that if you look at the distribution of prices, a relative reduction in the number of homes sold at just under 600,000 and then a little spike at 600,000, which you would expect, given that that's the maximum for the scheme. In terms of house prices increasing, if you've bought your Help to Buy property already, this capital gain will, if you've bought your property already and there is going to be a problem down the line, as Henry might be worried about, then if you've already bought it, then you have experienced the big capital gain. House prices went up by 10% in 2013 and in 2014. So I'm not too worried about people who've already bought. There's a question about people who are going to continue to buy in the years ahead between now and when the scheme ends, in its current form in 2021 and then in its somewhat diminished form, but not in London actually, form in 2023, whether or not if house prices are about to plateau or even they're falling right now in London, aren't they? So there could be more problems there. We'll get onto this later, but the extent to which the scheme is tapered away is of course really relevant to what happens to the market and to individuals. The government's already announced a 2-year tapering that doesn't affect London. They might announce something different, they might change their policies. And then the bigger overall thing that's definitely worth thinking about and reflecting on is Help to Buy. Yes, it might have an inflationary effect on house prices and means that people are overpaying for a home, but there's also strong evidence that also just is common sense in a way that people who are using Help to Buy are actually buying bigger and maybe better homes and homes in better locations than they otherwise would have done. So it isn't exactly like with like. So they might be stretching themselves to get a better home that Help to Buy then helps them get a home that has maybe more bedrooms or is in a better location. So the people coming along in 10 years' time to buy that house without Help to Buy are not necessarily going to be the 22-year-old first-time buyers that the people who bought it were 10 years ago, if you know what I'm saying. There might be people who are further along who, let's say, already had a child, for example. So because people have stretched to get better properties, and that this is a whole thing that we can discuss in terms of whether or not the policy is efficient as it could, because people would have bought anyway. But that's just
we'll be coming on
exactly.
To that. And can I just ask if you could write to us with that data you referred to
about
earlier
the 600.
About the 600, the bunching, and
I think it was
things like that. If you know where it's available,
I can send you
the
report. Yeah.
That would be excellent.
Can I just say that apart from that sort of pricing bunching, what you might also find, and again, I don't know of any specific research done on this, but you would expect to find a supply response in terms of size of properties built as well. Because if you think you could build, let's say, 10, 1,200, 5 1,200 square foot homes, or 5 1,200 or 10 600 square foot at £1,000 a square foot value, you're more likely to build more of the smaller ones than a few of the larger ones. So it has a potential to skew the market in terms of the size built as well as the pricing points built too. They're two sides of the same.
Because I'm a bit thick. Why are you more likely to build?
Well, because you're more likely to potentially twice as likely to sell into the £600,000 market than you are into the £1.2 million market.
Be more profitable.
Well, if the costs are the same per square foot, then it wouldn't be. It'd just be sales rates would say ultimately more profitable.
I should hand back to Samuel McCurtain. Sorry, but Henry, did you want to?
I've no idea of how much data you all have. I happen to have the London Help to Buy numbers, which I can give you very briefly, if you already have them. Last year, in the year to 31st of December, home purchases under Help to Buy in London total 5,643, up 26% from 2017.
We've got this, I think.
Cool.
Yeah, but thank you there, Henry. I'm sorry, Samuel McCurtain. I'll hand back to you for the rest of your question section.
Nearly finished actually. But maybe pick up on that point, Henry, if I could. You talked about the number of Help to Buy homes in London, but how are they distributed around London? Is it even distribution or uneven? And if not, why not?
It's not evenly distributed. There are some helpful numbers which I can supply to you if that be helpful. Greenwich, Barnet, Lewisham, Havering, Hillingdon, Tower Hamlets are the boroughs in which the scheme has been most used to date. a table that I can supply to you for the 40% equity loan in London came into effect in February 2016. 1,500 completions in the last quarter of last year is the largest number of any quarter. And they still only total nearly 17,000 loans out of the London's housing stock. To give you an example, as Yolande was mentioning, referenced it earlier on, before the credit crunch, sales in London were somewhere in the order of 16 to 20,000 a month, peaking at 16 to 20,000 a month. Is that correct? Happy with that?
Sounds right.
Yeah. Average over the last 20 years, about 10,000 homes are sold, old and new, every month, according to the ONS. Currently, we're down about 30% last month. So far, about 7,000 properties were transacted. And one of the things you must please bear in mind, as far as I'm concerned, is that a lot of the new build, and therefore the implications of Help to Buy on the new build volumes and the type of new build that was produced, will also have been, I think, probably much more greatly impacted by the perceived demand. London as a destination of choice for overseas buyers, for example, will have had a much greater impact on what house builders chose to build. Our memories are short. We may have forgotten that that was something that was a thing 3 or 4 years ago. Help to Buy much more relevant to house builders today because that interest and that demand has withered.
On the variation, there is considerable variation on take-up between boroughs, and particularly first-time buyer take-up. There's differences not only between boroughs, but also between the first-time buyers and the home movers. I remember Hackney had a large proportion, I think, of first-time buyer, whereas Islington much lower. And I think there may be a kind of age relationship. The equity gap problem tending to affect younger purchasers more than older ones, generally speaking. So there are some important sort of demographic and locational differences.
What about the split between houses and flats? I mean, how does that sort of work out with Help to Buy? And
must be you.
Is it sort of in line with the general
New
market?
build
Or is it?
no, it must be a higher proportion of flats because the new build market is a much higher proportion of flats.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Curtin. And now we're going to hand over to Assemblymember Berry, who has got a section of questions looking at the people that Help to Buy has helped in London.
Yes, this is the house buyers, home buyers, as opposed to the house builders. So just a few questions about how it works. I'm not sure who the best person to ask about this is, but in terms of who's eligible, is it limited to first-time buyers? Do the people have to live in the homes that they're buying? Are they allowed to own other property when they do it? And who are they? Which kinds of Londoners are buying these homes? I'm not sure who the best person to ask would be. Daniel, maybe?
Yeah,
in terms of profiling?
I can certainly kick off. So overall, in terms of the scheme itself, you don't have to be a first-time buyer. You don't live in the home when you buy it. Anyone is eligible to take up Help to Buy loans. If you're not a first-time buyer, then you have to be moving. You can't use it to get a second property, as far as I'm aware. Yeah, and the limit is £600,000 in London. So you can't use it to buy a property worth more than £600,000. And the minimum deposit you have to club together is 5%, and then the government loan, the maximum that the government will loan is 40%. So, but you could club together a bigger deposit, and the government could still give 40%. Is that right? Or does the government, or does it cap itself at 45? I'm not quite sure.
It will only give you 40%.
It will only give you 40, but yeah.
And
So
the ceiling has to be 600,000.
So, but in theory, you wouldn't do this, but I think you could get together a deposit of 60%. No one exists who does this, and get a Help to Buy equity loan on the other 40, and then not even take out a mortgage. I think you could, but no one would do that. So that's a bit by the by.
Are you sure nobody's ever done that?
I don't know why you would. I don't know why you would. So anyway, that's a bit of helpful sort of bit of background. The thinking behind it, basically, if you think of it in those terms, is it basically helps you get a bigger deposit together, because you don't have to go to the lender to get the whole, say if you've only got 5% that you can only afford to save, you don't have to get 95% from the lender. You can get get less than that, you can get 55 with the government putting in 40%. So that's the whole point, to help get over that big deposit barrier. In terms of who is benefiting from Help to Buy in London, annoyingly, the data that the government collect is mainly national. So we know that across the country as a whole, 10% of people who got a house under Help to Buy had household income that was greater than £8,000 a year. So that's quite high. 20% across England as a whole are non-first-time buyers. But actually on that one, I think we know that, yeah, we do. We've got this on another sheet of paper here. 95% of the people in London who use Help to Buy are first-time buyers. So it isn't overwhelmingly first-time buyer thing in London. We also have statistics, this is going back to when the scheme was announced in 2013, that we can see what size loan they got. So 7 in 10 people who use Help to Buy in London are getting a loan of 40%, so they're going up to the maximum. So it's people who are really taking advantage of the scheme, not just using the minimum amount. In general, across the UK as a whole, again, just to give you another way of getting at what I was saying with my 10% of them, 10% of people who've used the scheme have incomes higher than 80,000. I had a look to see how the income distribution of people who use Help to Buy compares to just the income distribution as a whole across the country. So the statistic uncovered is that a quarter of those who've taken Help to Buy loans have household incomes above 60,000, and that compares with 1 in 10 of all households aged under 40, so I just limited to that. So you can see that it is a scheme that is skewed towards people who are higher earning, and that is the same in London as well. So yeah, we don't know much. I don't know whether either you've got any access to any of these systems. We don't know much about whether it's men or women, how old the people are who are using the scheme. We know where. We know, for example, there's only 2, I think, in Kensington and Chelsea, people that have used it over the whole time, and we know what they paid for their property and what their income is. But that's about as much as we can do on the data that we have.
Okay, that's really useful.
Worth pointing out that from 2021 it will be first-time buyers only.
It will be limited to first-time buyers.
Can
I just ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah, sure.
Is that based on evidence that it was going towards people who were not a bit too often?
I wouldn't dare second guess why policy has changed, but that's what
I think that there is probably thinking out there, and I think if you talk to someone in the public, they would probably say, actually, even though this is a loan, so it's not adding to the deficit, and the government should get it back depending on what happens, that the government shouldn't be spending money to help people who've already got houses. I think that's just a view that people would hold, and I think that seems quite sensible.
What you said about people who need to be moving to qualify if they're buying a second-hand, if they're buying a home, that then they already own a home.
Yeah.
Is there any checks that they don't own another home? Like you're moving your residence, but if you have other homes that are not your residence, are those people allowed to benefit?
I don't think
it is
they
a
are,
subsidy,
no.
isn't it?
You're not allowed to use it if you've already owned a second home, and you're not allowed to use it to go and get a second home.
Right. Okay, that's really useful to know. Thank you. Sorry, Tom.
I was just on the first bit. I mean, do you know what the state of, did the government ever state the rationale for not limiting it to first-time buyers, and should they have limited it to first-time buyers?
In my view, no, they shouldn't, because actually the biggest impact of the global financial crisis was to lower transactions, as I described earlier, across the board. But transaction levels have recovered most in the first-time buyer sector. They still remain at historic lows in the sort of second steppers, as you might call them. It's actually more difficult to trade up the market than it is to get on the sort of bottom rungs of the ladder, as you might say. And the signs are, even now, that actually it's those second steppers that need more help to trade up to the family house or whatever it is. And I think this is another unforeseen or unmonitored consequence, that people might end up stuck in a certain type of property that isn't adequate to their needs and appropriate for what they need going forward. So actually there is a case for helping, in my view, those people who are stuck, unable to raise the deposit to trade up to their next move.
But then, you know, if one was being cynical, which obviously none of us are, you know, helping people in that second stage would also be quite likely to increase the amount of stamp duty that might be accruing to the government.
It possibly would. The signs are that the way people are behaving now, I noticed that the latest figures for migration out of London are that there's net out migration in every age group now, even younger age groups. So my reading of that is that affordability and housing issues are pushing people out, and it's what's happening is they're buying their home they need in another, interestingly, urban, usually small city, you know, elsewhere, either in southeast or even further afield. So it's
well,
not
that's
like
pretty
to a suburb,
obvious.
but you know
It's an obvious consequence, because this is basically a demand side measure rather than a supply side measure, isn't it?
Yes, and but if it's designed to help people who are unable to access the homes they need in London, you could argue it's not working because there comes a point in the life cycle where they need a home that it doesn't exist or can't be provided for within.
Well, that's
this
if you
scheme.
accept the premise that it's actually there
Can
to
I-
help people access a home.
Sorry, can I hand this back to Assemblymember Berry for now? But I'm happy to bring you in at the end.
We
if
are
you'd
we are
like,
going to
yeah.
get later on into the
Yeah.
yes, exactly. Because there are there's other things we could spend quite this large amount of money on potentially to give people access to homes to live in, but we're not here to discuss that. I wanted to ask about back to the people and what they're paying rather than market questions. When you've done this, and I think what you've said so far is people are getting together 5% as a deposit generally. They're generally borrowing under the Help to Buy scheme 40%, and then they're getting a mortgage for the other 55%. And I think you've said those people are sort of stretching themselves to buy bigger and better homes. So presumably they're borrowing up to their borrowing limit as well with that 55%. Is that they're not borrowing less than they can afford to repay, if that makes sense. So overall, how are the costs comparing with, say, private renting, if you include the mortgage repayments, which are as much as people could probably afford, plus now, starting last year, people are starting to have to repay parts, they have to pay charges on the equity loan.
I think my first guess would be that the cost of living in a Help to Buy bought home will be relatively will be pretty much the same as the cost of living in any other home that you bought, which we know is lower than the cost of renting. And that is mainly because at the moment interest rates are so low. So the big thing, if you go back a few decades, if you go back to the 1970s, was really high interest rates. People could cobble together a deposit really easily. They owned their own home, but then they had really high day-to-day housing costs because interest rates were so high. So people often think about the baby boomers really doing well out of the housing market, and that's true. But there was this time in the 1970s when people that had bought their homes really struggled to pay back their interest rates on a day-to-day basis. That's all gone now. People that managed to get over that massive deposit hurdle, which is really big in London, relative to incomes and to earnings, their day-to-day housing costs are quite low. And just as you were saying there, the first 5 years for someone who's in a Help to Buy owned in a Help to Buy bought property, they're going to be having really quite low housing costs because they're not paying anything. Is it £120 of the fee each year, something like that? Mm-hmm. There's a small fee that you have to pay, and then that's it. And it's 5 years interest free, and then they have this ratcheting up interest rate for years after, which we might discuss, which could be a problem if you stay in the home for a long time. But
this is what this question's about,
yeah.
So go into detail on that if you like.
Yeah, so the specific way it works is you have 5 years where you don't have any interest rate on the loan that the government has given you in effect, and then the first year you're charged 1.75, which is quite low, and that's probably lower than interest rates that people are paying on mortgages at the moment. Unless you had a really small, a really short term fixed term, say for the first 2 years or something. And then in year 7, you're charged the 1.75 times whatever the rate of RPI inflation is, which is all a bit confusing. But basically, it's a really odd way of doing it.
1.75 times 3.
No, so times, it would be
Yeah,
times
it's
1.03. 1.03, for example.
1.03.
Okay, so that's increased by that percentage.
Yeah, and then
Sorry.
a year,
Yeah.
and then yeah. So it might go up. So for example, from like 1.75 to 1.83 to 1.89, but it's going up and up and up. So and it's going up with inflation rather than other metrics that you might often link. Well, that you do link your mortgage to, which is interest rate. So it's this odd thing. I don't actually think they call it an interest rate. I think they call it a payment or something like that, charge. So these are probably going to be surprising people across the country now, and particularly in London. The higher loan of 40% came in 2016, so it's not till 2021 that the Londoners, mainly in outer London, that got their Help to Buy properties are going to suddenly have a bit more to pay, and it is quite a bit more.
So, can I have some numbers? If you had a mortgage that was 55% of £600,000 at current interest rates, roughly what would you be paying a month?
I think
I'm a private renter, so I've got private renting as a benchmark.
600,000. 600,000 mortgage.
If you have 55%
of 600,000. Let's go. 30.
Who's going to get the calculator out?
300 grand.
I haven't got the
Ballpark is
1,200
good.
1,200 quid.
1,200?
It'll be lower. So research I've done across European capitals, including London, shows that mortgage payments are lower than private rented, pretty much across the
Which is
board.
about, if we say 600 is the benchmark here, then about 1,200 is right?
Depends what interest rate you're paying, of course.
yeah.
You're only getting this for a period of time, obviously, while you've got the government's loan.
So but to begin with, you're just paying your mortgage payments, and it's 1,200.
Well,
And then,
Yes, on the 55%, you're paying a commercial mortgage rate.
Yeah.
yeah.
And that will be probably significantly lower than rent.
So say you have got your 55% is your mortgage, and 55% of 600,000 is 330,000. And say your interest rate's 4%. I don't know.
No, it would be about 2.5.
Do you want to go?
fixed.
3. Split it 3.
We'll go for 3. Then you're paying £9,900 a year on your mortgage side of things. Okay, so there you go. There's one number that we got to collectively.
That's it. We're not doing any more numbers.
Sorry, I just to clarify,
That's less than £1,000 a month.
for the first 5 years, you're not paying anything on the.
I think you pay a fee of £120.
You pay
It's significantly cheaper than private renting.
Yeah.
It's cheaper than and it's cheaper than having a mortgage because for the first 5 years you're not paying.
While interest rates are low.
Yes.
Well, the 55% is the mortgage,
Yes.
and then
So the
and
MPC
then you
and
have
the
to
loan.
add on the loan.
A 7-member variant.
So, and carry on from that then,
Math.
if once you have to start paying 1.75% per year of the remaining 40%, this should be easy, what's that?
Okay, well it's 270,000 times 0.175. 0.01, whoa. That's 4,700.
4,700 a year.
Yeah.
So that then brings it up to more like private renting on a £600,000 flat. You'd then be looking at £13,500 a year.
That's
Correct.
cheap.
My instinct is that that's cheap.
I pay
That's
more
cheap.
than that. My
About
PRS.
twice that. It's about 500 a week.
I pay significantly less than £1,350 a month for mine.
And you're lucky.
But I'm in zone 2, so I'm extremely lucky. Anyway, so that's just to get some figures on that. That's useful to know as an average ballpark. Yeah.
That's going up, sorry. That's going up. So you'll be paying 1.75 this year, and then you might be paying something like 1.83 the year after, and then what? So that
And your
that
interest
4,000 bit is going. Though hopefully you're paying down your mortgage at the same time, so or trying to.
Yeah, your quote was essentially an interest-only payment, wasn't it?
Sorry.
You did just the
Yeah,
interest. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so it's good. Is it that's roughly the same as shared ownership? Is it? I mean, is shared ownership a better deal? Shared ownership's limited to people with incomes less than 90,000. So it's actually an option for the same kinds of people who seem to be benefiting from Help to Buy.
About shared ownership is that you'll be paying rent on the equity loan bit, the bit you don't own. You'll also, if capital values do go up, you'll only be making it on the proportion you own, whereas under this scheme, you're making it on the full 600,000 or 100% of the value.
That's not
Right.
It's an equity loan scheme, so you only at the end of it, if you sell a house for more, you share that uplift.
You share it.
You share
You share the capital.
One of the great ironies is that the national government has the defence that their scheme, whatever the flaws I accuse it of having, has actually made money, which is irritating.
It's worth saying, I guess.
That's fair. That's fair.
Help to Buy does cover more than just this scheme. It also covers the Help to Buy ISA, which I think ends this year, later this year. And there are shared ownership schemes under Help to Buy, which I confess I don't know a great deal about. So
there's also one huge thing that I'm sure you understand, but it bears repeating just in case. And I happen to have the actual numbers for it, which makes a change. The London average Help to Buy London transaction price in London is currently £455,000. 455. Yeah? Without Help to Buy, and the deposit for that's required is 23 grand. If you didn't have Help to Buy, the average deposit would be closer to £70,000. Now, I appreciate that your committee's interest in this is coming up perhaps or considering alternatives to Help to Buy, but in the minds of the general public, they don't look at the potential for home ownership and equate it with, I could rent somewhere, or I could have some sort of shared ownership, one of the other excellent schemes that your authority puts forward. There is still this absurd desire within the general population to own their own home.
Well, that's what I was just getting onto. I was trying to ask about a comparison between this and shared ownership and nail down some of the numbers on that. So can I continue? Is that all right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thank you. So if you were doing shared ownership on a £600,000 home, you'd be getting a quarter share and then paying some rent and all of that. The overall costs would be more?
I don't know. I don't know whether other members of the panel...
Why would they be different from Help to Buy?
Well, that's what I'm thinking. It must work out around about the same, would you not think?
But
it might depend who you're sharing with. If you're sharing with a housing association, you may be paying a sub-market rent on the remaining portion that you don't own. It really all depends on whether that's a market rent or a sub-market rent. But 1.75% is bound to be lower than certainly a full market rent on that remaining 40%. So if you went into a straight shared ownership arrangement and were paying full market rent on 40%, even with the escalating rate after 5 years, you're almost certainly paying more for rent on that 40% than you are.
That makes some sense.
I think because rather than getting too bogged down in figures here, we could always do a little market survey as part of our,
I would love to know a comparison between
and do
the
some
three,
comparators for
that was
our
the question
report.
I was trying to work out.
I think, dare I say, as a researcher, there is further research to be done on this.
Yeah, but a typical
it
case
might
study.
help you to know that the average nationally, the average mortgage on a Help to Buy, the 55% mortgage element, people are borrowing on average 3.65 times their income. Generally speaking, the maximum's about 4. The way that and so that reflects a more constrained lending environment. So back in the late 80s, people were borrowing 5 times or more. So just to set that bit in context.
So people are taking less of a risk on.
It's massively de-risked. The mortgage element is massively de-risked, because it's only 55%, B, because the lending constraints are quite tight.
Okay, so one difference between this and shared ownership is you do properly own the home, don't you? There's an equity agreement with the government to repay the equity, plus the capital gain on their share when you sell. That's right, isn't it? And you gain on the other half, on the bit that you've bought yourself.
Correct.
But the government gets profits. What you're saying a minute
Correct.
ago is the government gets profit as on
or loss.
Or loss. Yes, exactly. It wins that the same share of the sale price back at the end of the day on a sale. Whereas with shared ownership, you do not own the whole thing. If you default on the rent, you can be evicted in the same kind of way. Yeah. Do you think people who are buying understand that they don't keep the whole share, because it doesn't seem... they're definitely not owning it. They're not gaining all the capital that they would be. This, I think, is at the heart of what you were saying before, Yolanda, about people not being able to trade up.
I don't think it's clear.
Hmm?
I don't know, from what I've read, it's not clear.
So their home's gone up by £50,000. They want to trade up because they've had extra children. They can't actually buy the next home up the ladder because they've got to repay the same proportion to the government, not just the original loan amount.
I guess they get to keep 60%. So the good news is
But the gap between what they can afford and what the cost of the next home is, the next home up in terms of sizes,
yes, it
is
does
actually
not solve
bigger.
the equity gap problem for the next move.
Yes.
And particularly as the scheme's being closed to second steppers and only open to first time buyers in future, it probably exacerbates the problem.
Yeah, so you've already outlined that earlier on as a risk. I'm here to ask about the risks of this sort of scheme. I think you've already gone into quite a lot of that, haven't you? The fact that new builds depreciation may be being overstated and form part of negative equity. The risk of obsolescence of certain types of houses is really interesting to us, because we've been looking in planning terms and in other ways at the housing associations. Are people building too many of these 1 and 2 bed homes that fit into the criteria, and are they potentially oversupplying those?
The simple answer to that is yes. I've done the research. It hasn't been published, and may yet get it published. But my findings.
We'd be very interested in that.
Really
Extremely interested to see that.
Yeah, this is an obsession.
Would the Assembly be interested in paying for this research? I feel a brokering opportunity.
I'm not paying your fees, Henry. Yes, there is. The work that I've done shows that there are distinct topologies which cost very significantly more to run over a long period of time. So we worked with Arup on this, and we projected forward the costs of maintenance, upkeep, recladding, window cleaning, the whole lot over a 30-year period. And it's... It is eye-watering, the difference between a simple sort of second-hand terraced house and what you'd expect to spend on that versus a typical building that you could see anywhere across the London skyline that we've been building over the last 10, 20 years. They are significantly more, costing significantly more to run and upkeep.
Grabbed Assembly Member Boff's attention.
And it's a real issue. I have had housing associations approach me with exactly the same question, because they've become very concerned about what they're having to spend. And indeed, private sector build-to-let landlords are going to become very concerned about this, and they'll find that the recladding, the glazing, the plant and machinery, the common parts, etc., are going to cost very much more.
We might ask you back when we're talking about
Is that going to be every week?
So to Henry, are there any risks we haven't talked about yet that you are aware of as a market commentator?
No, I mean, you've got a very
good.
You have a very good handle on it. I mean, the commercial pressures to deliver products that meets the criteria, that the market is being artificially pumped to desire, has all sorts of connotations, such as those that Yolande has just outlined in her last comments. I mean, it is. There are loads of reasons why the end of Help to Buy can't come too soon, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, and to all of you, finally, do you agree with some commentators who suggest that the main beneficiaries of Help to Buy have been the house builders themselves?
For sure.
Yes or no, all of you?
Really simple, yes, it has to be. I think it would be difficult for anyone.
You
for one of
described it
them
as Help to
sitting here.
Build.
I mean, we've got an empty seat here, but it'd be very difficult to say that.
That's not to say they don't try. The house building fraternity are very keen to continue to deny that it has distorted the market in their favour or that they've profited from it. I described it in the print as the crack cocaine of the housing market. It is something that we are addicted to, and coming off it will be very painful.
Well, if they hadn't profited from it, I mean,
Sorry.
it would appear, well, they would be facing a different sort of panel of shareholders to ask why they haven't. So, I mean, I'm not going to criticise them from profiting from it, but the very fact that those simple facts of what appears to be increased build rates, of course, will lead to greater profit, and it must have benefited those who built.
So we've got some case studies of companies with really quite decent margins, with profits that are rising. This isn't a struggling industry anymore, I think we can conclude, particularly in terms of its profitability.
And it's fair to point out that I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that they do profit. If you outsource a solution to the private sector, they are going to want and demand, and it would be justifiable to pay them for the privilege of doing it. This is not an answer to social housing. This is a very different solution to a very different problem.
I think the flip side of the house builders benefiting, which they have, I'm sure they will have benefited, is that there are 170,000 households up and down the country that, because of this scheme, were either able to buy a house because they had in effect a bigger deposit, or were able to get a house that was bigger than one that they were initially thinking of getting, or in a better location. So yeah, some developers and some builders have benefited, but the scheme's aim was to help people get onto the housing ladder, to help them overcome this massive deposit barrier that's become a thing because house prices have raced away over decades because interest rates have fallen, and it has achieved that to some extent. Now there's a wider question around, I think it's 9.9 billion they've loaned out already. Should the government have spent money elsewhere on loans or other guarantees for other products? I don't know, for for sale housing. That's a big question about priorities.
It's our next question.
Right,
We'll be coming on to that very shortly.
That is the question that results.
Just yes, they've benefited, but we shouldn't forget that the 170,000 families, 12,000 in London, that have benefited from this.
There are 2 points probably that I think are worth making, and that is that if the supply of private sector homes, new build homes is rising, you would expect, if planners are doing their job, for a proportion of affordable housing to be built on the back of that. So I guess at the social housing end, you've got to acknowledge that supply must have been increased over and above what it would otherwise be, provided those that affordable housing percentage was provided. But that kind of emphasises my first point, that it doesn't deal with that middle market. If you're building sort of expensive at one end and affordable at the other, but nothing in the middle, the problems of affordability still exist in that middle market. The other thing that I think it's worth pointing out is that it is true. I was looking at it from the sort of builder side. You know, we think that all this is translating into pure profit. Of course, the very important thing that we must consider it's also translating to is land price, because it's not true that all the surplus is taken by developers as profit. It will have benefited landowners as well, or has the potential to distort land markets, both by increasing demand for land, as more people want to do more stuff. Unfortunately, you can't just create supply out of thin air. The supply of land remains finite, and discuss the relative benefits. There may be some cases where the majority of any extra revenue has gone into land purchase rather than pure profit. So don't make the automatic sort of assumption that all the excess, as it were, is channeled into profit.
That's really interesting what you say about affordable housing, because I think if you were to plot help to buy homes against amount of affordable housing, we would not find them correlated at all, and we can probably do that as well. And the other thing is that when it comes to individual planning decisions and trying to get affordable housing from private developers, land price plays a big part in that calculation, and it's not a good one. If it's high, then we get less affordable housing. So it's really, it's a very complicated picture, and knock-on effects can be quite,
Bear in mind that if we talk about house price increases, we're actually talking about land price increases. It's the price of the neighbourhood that Henry was talking about earlier that actually rises. It's not the cost, build costs have gone up way lower than the cost of housing. So it's the land that's increased in value.
Thank you, Assembly Member Berry. Just finally on this section, Assembly Member Curtin earlier asked about what proportion of freehold and leasehold, and I've actually realised that I've got the figures here, and in London it's 84% of Help to Buy sales are flats, of which 98.1% are leasehold, compared to outside of London 11% of sales are flats and 81% of sales are freehold. And I just wondered, Henry, we've had various scandals with leasehold recently, and do you know, for example, any evidence of developers trying to get buyers to use preferred solicitors, for example, any issues with excessive ground rents and things like that related to the Help to Buy scheme?
I don't think we've yet seen the implications, bearing in mind the scheme is relatively young, therefore the number of people selling their property purchased under Help to Buy has been very small. In London, 15,000, 16,000 transactions so far. The proportion of those that will have sold will be tiny. And we don't have access to the data that you understandably would like to know, because it's captured and held by one party, almost invariably the developer. Will there be problems that are exposed when the tide goes out? Inevitably. I expect them to be. There'll be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth and a lot of finger pointing. Yes is the answer to your question.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that, though, that I think the leasehold, sort of new build leasehold scandal, such as it is actually for houses outside London. And the reason there's such a high proportion of leasehold is simply because the new build market in London is almost exclusively flatted, it's apartments. So you've no choice really but to have some kind of leasehold. I suppose you could have common hold arrangements, but leasehold holds the norm. So I don't think you should assume automatically that these are problem leaseholds. They shouldn't be.
Well, I'll hand over now to Assembly Member Boff for our last question section.
You've already commented about how effective the Help to Buy scheme has been in London, so I'm going to move on. Despite my colleagues' criticism of market intervention and Keynesianism at the moment, I think that's probably just temporary on your part, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering whether or not we need, do we need a successor programme to Help to Buy, or do we just let the market rip? Perhaps, Mr. Pryor, you can.
Kill it, drown it, put it out, leave it out in the cold.
Full stop.
Get rid of it, stop it.
Yeah.
Can't put it more strongly. Cease.
And are there going to be risks from that immediate stop?
Yes, for all the reasons we've, I think, outlined already, but I'm very happy to go through again. People are the proud owners of homes for which they have paid more than they would otherwise have paid, that they won't be able to sell for as much, and the profit element in the event of those who've been lucky enough to enjoy house price inflation won't be all accrued to them.
So you see no role for any kind of government intervention to stimulate the market?
The less intervention, the better. Please.
I'm the choir and you're preaching to me. Could Professor Barnes, what do you think should be, how should a replacement
I think probably
programme?
for pragmatic reasons, I would suggest that maybe it's less kind of draconian and sudden than that, but I think the aim should be to phase it out, and arguably it's something that should already have gone. I mean, certainly as far as London's concerned, the house builders were not in having not an endangered industry from about 2009 onwards, I would say. So.
But you see no place for any successor programme?
I think there are other ways to more usefully help the truly squeezed and where the affordability problems truly lie, and I don't think it lies necessarily in house buying or home buying so much as home occupation of all types.
So you kind of see it as pitching to a different client?
I think you have to view the market in its entirety from top to bottom, and I think at the moment we're really ignoring the too difficult problem, which is the people who can't afford more than £450 per square foot, either in rent or in any kind of mortgage. Whether there is a case, I think there will still be a case, even if you did away with Help to Buy, for some help over the sheer size of that equity deposit that's needed. But that might lie in straightforward shared ownership of a different kind. I'm just wondering if a more equitable thing to do would be to say stop targeting. I think the most important thing is probably to stop targeting it only at new build. I just can't. I think that's too distorting because of the nature of new build. So a halfway house. Well, it wouldn't be a halfway house because it actually costs more. It would broaden it out. Would be to stop making it so targeted. I think the future targeting at first-time buyers only will further distort the market. So you've got, at the moment, you've got that sort of squeeze middle.
Surely the market will still be distorted even if you...
Well, the market is distorted by all sorts of things. Stamp duty
yes.
distorts it.
Yeah.
That adds to the equity barrier by increasing the cost of moving. You know, if you make any intervention, it will have a distorting effect automatically, in my view. Probably the sort of effects we've talked about on the new build sector in London are particularly unhelpful because of the longer term issues that are then created.
Mr. Tomlinson, do you see any successor programme that might be worthwhile?
I support what the government has set out to do, which is to not get rid of it instantly, but to do some sort of tapering away. I think that a return to schemes before Help to Buy, where you had an income cap, seemed like a sensible thing as an alternative way of tapering away. But they've chosen regional house price cap, so I think that's a good thing. I don't think the scheme should run and run. I was reading in preparation for this committee. You can see there's people giving evidence to, I think, the House of Lords Committee on Housing in 2015, saying it should stop. People have been saying it should stop for a long time, and it should. The housing market shouldn't need this. But the thing to think about is, what was the point of the scheme? To help people get a bigger deposit. So then they could jump over that massive barrier, which is the blockage to people being able to own their own home. Now, Henry might think they're odd, but people want to own homes. And we've done surveys at the Resolution Foundation.
That sentiment has always comes from people who own their own home, but everybody else doesn't need to. But, I don't know if that's the case.
Do you want a disclosable interest?
No, I don't.
If you survey young people in the UK today and ask them what is the big thing that you think the economy isn't delivering for you on relative to your parents, they all talk about housing. Much more than anything else. So people want to own their own home. The way to get into home ownership is to be able to surmount that big deposit barrier. Now, you could do, it's really glib to say it, but you can do more building, which in the long run has an effect on house prices, which reduces...
If you're doing the right thing in
the right place. Which, if you build it in the right places, and it can have an effect. But there are other things that happen because of the market and other things the government could do to get the deposit barrier to shrink the deposit barrier to make it more surmountable. So again, I guess it seems a bit glib and a bit general, but...
Do you see a space for example, if we're talking about a scheme that does effectively help you with the deposit, do you see a larger role for the house builder to actually take in such a scheme?
Well, no, I don't think so, but I think that what's happening anyway, and you can track the data since the financial crisis, is that one of the big things that stopped people being able to get on the housing ladder was the reining in of credit conditions. And we've seen that the loan to value ratio that lenders are willing to give, I think it plummeted to something like, it plummeted and now it's gone back up again, basically. And we're almost back to where we were before the crisis in terms of what lenders are willing to lend to first-time buyers, which means they can have a smaller deposit. So that's an important thing. And it means that it's becoming relatively easier to get onto the housing ladder than it was 3 or 4 years ago in terms of credit conditions. Lenders are offering longer mortgages as well, which can help, but helps in a different way. And then I think there's wider things that the government could do to rebalance demand, as it were, for housing. So, for example, recently, because of an amendment that they accepted as friendly from the House of Lords, they're allowing local authorities to increase the surcharges on empty homes think it's going to go up to 400% after the home's been empty for a few years. That's like a good thing to support, to encourage people to not have empty homes that they might just be keeping empty to get returns on. The government could go further in terms of forcing local authorities not to give discounts to people who've got second homes, for example. They could reform council tax. There are lots of different changes that you could make to the tax system to incentivise, basically to support first-time buyers and to make it a bit more difficult for people who already own a home to get a second home, for example. That would help.
Throwing 3.2 billion pounds back in the economy is bound to help somewhere.
Well, maybe by your analysis, it would be better spent on keeping the Help to Buy ISA open to enable people to raise that deposit for the purchase of any home for themselves, rather than subsidising the new build sector.
Yeah. So there's different ways to spend that amount of money if the government finds money. At the moment, the Mayor offers a London portal which includes properties for sale through Help to Buy. Do you think that adds value at all to the process? And is there any other kind of role the Mayor might be able to take in terms of Help to Buy?
I think your portal's very good. I don't think anyone knows about it. Well, obviously people do, but inevitably you only have so much resource to be able to promote it. I think it's brilliant. Great idea. I'd encourage you to try and partner with someone in the private sector or the publicly quoted private sector like Rightmove and Zoopla, who I'm sure could be persuaded that there are reasons why they want to get behind it. All power to your elbow.
Perish the thought that we should partner with somebody who makes a profit. Any other role for the Mayor?
It's difficult to see a role for the Mayor in what is a national scheme, a government scheme, as opposed to a local scheme, other than information.
Okay, thank you. The government has recently been putting more money into affordable rented homes. Is that the right direction of travel? I'll go to Mr. Pryor on this because you expressed an opinion about ownership. Do you think the government should be investing more into affordable homes?
They should be
affordable rented homes.
They and the Mayor's office, with due respect, should be spending much more of your finite amount of time in that sector. I would encourage you to do so.
Good. Anyone else on that?
I think what's very clear is that you don't significantly increase supply unless you increase it in all sectors and all areas, and then for that reason it's important to encourage build to rent and renting of all sorts. My concern continues to be actually whether it's Help to Buy or any other encouragement, is that if we want to see a beneficial supply side effect, it has to be the right supply in the right place. That can be in tenure terms, but it also has to be in the terms of the type of housing and the sort of places that it's not just that it's being built in, but that's being created by it. And I think there's a much broader issue with diversifying our housing supply. At the moment, we're completely reliant on what is really a very, very niche sector, especially in London.
So do you think any future scheme should have a view of the topology of homes in what it supports? Bearing in mind the research you have done.
Yes, ideally. Oh gosh, I sense a crossover here with my role as advisor on the Build Better, Build Beautiful Commission here, but what we build will make a huge difference to its future social, environmental and economic value, and I think there's an inadequate understanding of that in not just the public sector. I think amongst private sector landlords there's a risk that they're building or buying the wrong type of stock to in simple terms achieve a long-term return for them, and in broader terms better social and environmental returns for the broader society. I think we're straying way beyond the remit of this committee, though. In that.
Yes, we are. But I had fun with that prize. So thank you very much. In fact, we can invite you all back again, I think, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think it's been very interesting. And do members have any final questions? Do our guests have any final thoughts they would like to offer us?
Figure I must correct. I said earlier it was 1 in 11 transactions in new build prior to 2013. It's actually 11%, roughly 1 in 9.
Thank you for clarifying that. Well, look, thank you all very much for coming. I think that was a very interesting session. And I should say at the beginning, we did invite developers and house builders to come in. We did at one point have one, but they had to pull out for whatever reason. But they seem to be a bit shy about coming and talking about Help to Buy. But it is a shame, and I hope that they will be submitting written evidence to us.
Can I check? We're going to write to them to ask for that.
I should hope so. Yes, yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yes. And we have had some. So anyway, can I thank our guests for your contributions? We have a few more formal items on the agenda we need to discuss that you're welcome to stay for, or you're free to go. So finally, can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion and agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any outputs from the discussion?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the remainder of its meeting dates in the 2019-20 Assembly year, the topic for the meeting on the 13th of June 2019, which will be a review of the Affordable Housing Monitor, and delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree the scope and terms of reference for the committee's review of the Affordable Housing Monitor on the 13th of June 2019. Thank you. Date of the next meeting. The next meeting of the Housing Committee is scheduled for 13th of June 2019 at 2 o'clock in the Chamber. There is no urgent business, so the meeting is closed. Thank you all very much. It's a relatively short meeting as well.
GLA, Committee Room 5,